And we have amazing speakers tonight again, so big hand of applause to welcome them.
Want to go ahead, or should I introduce?
Okay, so hi, my name is Fanny Rebillard. Thanks for the invitation, Max. I'm a musicologist, and now I'm a record manager, or what you call a digital archivist. That's basically people taking care of all the stuff you don't want to take care of. So we are pretty annoying. And I am also, because I have those specific subject and I'm specialized into the study of video game music and sound, I'm also a journalist and a speaker in France. That's why I'm more at ease in French. And I also love to do Twitter threads about all kind of stuff about music. I write every 2 months on game cults, and I used to work for jeuxvideo.com, and I write for Canard PC Hardware, and that's all for all the stuff I have to say about myself.
Okay. I'll do a more formal presentation in my part, but just shortly, I'm from Montreal. I've started a company called Plug. I'm going to get back to that, but basically, should we just roughly say what the talk is about?
Yes.
It's basically video game music preservation and all its various aspects. I'll be concentrating on the technical challenges, although to be honest, I'm really like ultra specialized in like the 8-bit up until the start of the 16-bit era video games, and not much after, because for me it's less interesting. But there are things that I know, and we can discuss about it. And so I'm ultra technical. I'm a programmer. I studied at Université de Montréal. And so it's like two worlds colliding, and it's very interesting.
Yes, so let's go. The first question is, what is archiving? Because in English you have a same word for a lot of different things. An archive can just be something that is left, but a digital archive especially is a system more than an object. A system designed for locating, storing, and providing access to materials over the long term. And locating, storing, providing, and long term are the most important words in an archive, because if you cannot locate it, something, if you don't have a secure way to store it, and if you cannot provide access and make people understand it, it's not an archive. It's just garbage, basically. So through time we have different ways of archiving, which can depend on who is doing the archiving. I have the French example, which is very specific, because in France we have an obligation, including video games, but every creation has to be deposited into some sort of copyright storage, and it's a national library who is taking care of it. So if you are French, or if you make a game that is coming out in France, you have the legal obligation to deposit it, and this is in a big library where you have all the books, all the CDs of music. You are supposed to have all the internet, but it's quite complicated, especially for games which are in Flash. And all this is working only with what came out for sale. So it's only commercial copies of the games and the CDs, etc., that are stored. But also it's here to grant a public access and to historians, to people who are curious. So it's not a very secret place. In the opposite, what I call private or company archiving, this is my job, actually, my real job. I'm a record manager, so here we take care in priority of what we don't want to see outside the companies. So we have to locate everything inside to deal with legal stuff, because if you are sued, well, you need to know where your files from 20 years earlier are, and if you don't know, where you're screwed. But we also have a lot of stuff to archive regarding project tracking, work in progress, because it's not because a project doesn't end now and doesn't come out that it will not be useful in 20 years. So it's really important to gain some time, and it's an idea that sometimes have have to struggle, because you don't care about what you're doing now that is not useful. But the most important thing to remember between these two vision of archiving is that they won't keep the same items. In National Library, you will have official stuff, but in company archives, you will have game design documents, you will have asset tools, intern tools that we don't have outside. So if you don't have the assets you had for your games, you cannot go to a national library and tell, hey, can I have my things back? It won't work. That's why it's very important to think about records management. So what is the problem with video game archiving? The first thing I notated is until recently it wasn't considered as an art. I'm not speaking about a philosophical debate here. It's a more political debate concerning money, because if there is a new art, it means you have to share what some of the art money you used to help preserve it. So some people were not very happy with the idea of cutting through their money. But the main problem actually with video game archiving is that it's a technological object that is evolving really, really fast. And I mean, we have three big problems in video game archiving. The first one, when we had just consoles and cartridge, is that they are temporary objects that were not designed to last very long. So we have to try to repair them. But I think you would speak much better about that, because you can't have the old chips. They are not made anymore. So if my NES is broken, how can I replace the chip if I don't know where are the last one? The second period is the arrival of online gaming, meaning, well, I can archive World of Warcraft, but if there is no server, if there is no player, what is the point? Is it still the same video game? No, it's not very useful. So that's a problem. And they tried to make some internal server at some libraries, but it was very complicated, and studios are not very willing to help for this. They don't like it at all. And the last and most recent problem, you might have it for your own tools, is what I call the login required problem, meaning that even if a game comes out and you don't need to play it online, well, it sometimes is difficult to play a game offline, because you have to prove that you have a certificate for the game, you have some copy and piracy protection, but also you have the fact that the game is always connected to some kind of browser or some kind of device, means that you have to update it for games updates, bug fixing, etc. But you also have to follow the OS updates and the evolution of the hardware. So that's how many mobile games, for start, cannot follow anymore the updates of the OS, because you cannot waste any more money or time to develop a new version of a game that is already over. Well, libraries have the same problem, because how can you archive a game if it doesn't work on any device anymore? It's a real problem. So some of them have old computer that they don't connect to the internet, certainly not, because if you plug in, it's over. And they try to keep the thing, most of the thing, the most they can, but it's quite difficult. So with all this problem in video game archiving, we have 5 common solutions. That's pretty much the only one, actually. Well, you can keep the original, that's a museum approach. Well, if everything works, fine. If it doesn't work, too bad. If you are afraid that you lose your original copy, you can make another copy. But if there is a problem in the original, well, you just copy the error. You can try to make a migration. It's also pretty complicated, because a migration is like rewriting the game. And in archiving, we have some pretty tough rules about how you can archive. It has to be the same as the original, and if it's not the same language as the original, well, it's not the same object. So there is some debates about migration. Is a remastered a migration, or is it a new game? So it's not very pertinent here.
No, it is.
And fourth, emulation. It has some big issues with music in particular. Most of the emulators you can find online has actually terrible music. So David will talk a lot better about that later. And finally, when nothing else is possible, well, you take your pen and you write a new game, and it was like that, and it has some kind of graphics, etc., etc. You can make videos. That's why YouTube videos are considered some kind of archive, because it's still a trace if you have lost some games. It's very frequent with arcade gaming, because we know we have lost a lot of arcade gaming, especially in Japan, where some games came out and they were testing it for 1-2 weeks and it wasn't working, so they just destroyed the original.
And the prices, if you get them like secondhand, are really expensive. The main guys can pay tens of thousands of dollars to acquire some rare PCBs.
Yeah.
And there are hoarders, they keep them and not share the ROMs.
They had some very arcade gaming used some very expensive materials. So when you have one arcade board and the arcade wasn't working, well, you reused it to make another game. So there were not any trace left of what was here before. Okay, so we have talked archive, we have talked video games. What is the problem with sound? Because we are here for that. Actually, it's an historical problem. There always have been a problem with sound. When I was a musicologist, I decided to study archiving because there was something that was bothering me about our sources to work. I was like, okay, we are hacking YouTube videos, or we are finding some MIDI on strange websites, but most of the times it doesn't work properly. So how can I know it's the real stuff? It's not the real music from the game. Something is wrong, and it was a great discovery actually. So with sound, we have a simple problem that sound cannot be stored in its initial states. Meaning, I don't know, this, I can put it in a box, and it comes out a few years later, it's still a tea bag. It hasn't changed much. I can identify it, I can read it, it's yellow, okay. But the sound I'm just making, I can't catch them and put them in a bottle, because they just disappear into thin air. It's a temporal substance, so in reality there is no sound archive possible, or at least no direct sound archive. If you want to store sound, you will have to go through a very specific process, which is putting this time phenomenon into a space case. So it's and to do that you need some kind of multi-layer languages. It will be more efficient with examples. So if I want to play music, I can have my instrument and improvise, but I can also read a sheet music. But a score is just it's an incomplete description of sound. You have a lot of things that are missing, basically, and you can interpret in the way you like. So it's very good. But in the 20th century, we invented someone great, and it's a sound engineer with all his tools. So we had suddenly the ability to capture sound through a microphone and to put it into a cassette, a vinyl, into every device you prefer. But those are physical devices, and while looking at it, you can't hear the sound. You will need another device to play the sound. And it has become more complicated with the digital era, because now we have a computer, so we can use electricity to transmit sound to the computer, and we can also use the computer to make new kinds of sheet music, which are very precise and very useful. We can make interactive music, etc. We can make compressed sound, we can make uncompressed sound. We have a lot of options. But we still need 3 layers of technological things to make it work. We have to capture, we have to store, and we have to play. And without these 3 components, we cannot listen to the sound And I'm sure there are lots of sound engineers and people that know microphones better than I, but you know that what you are going to capture with your microphone is not the exact same sound. It will change a little because there are all kinds of microphones, etc. So here we are. In video games, we have the same menace because we have multiple sound formats. David will talk about them.
That's a famous spreadsheet online that everybody's sharing.
We have multiple tools and also multiple software, and it's very important when you do archiving to have a knowledge of these three components. And I will give a few examples just after that. Just to start where I'm going to go now that we have finished with the generalities. There have been some missing pieces in the video game sound industry. And there are a lot of video game fans that are doing amateur work and try to retrace how composers and sound designers work, but without asking them. So here is an example that is just incredible. It's a spreadsheet, Gboy's VGM instrument source spreadsheet. It has 4,000 lines, and it's a list that begins in 1992 of every game, a lot of games on Nintendo.
Yeah.
It's
From
pretty
Super
much,
Nintendo.
yeah,
and
it goes from the Super Nintendo to the Switch, and it's in every game, every file. They retrace all the sound source, what instrument, what synthesizer, what kind of sound did they use. I don't know how they do it. I think they do it by ear.
Yep.
So it's just a gigantic list of every sample that has been used in a video game.
Yeah, it's not 100% accurate. And some of
That's
it
a problem.
is like guesswork to some extent, but most of it you can listen and say, oh yeah. Some things are a stretch, but it's the best thing of its kind, really.
Because it's quite complicated. But for example, for historian, it's very important because here I can see that in the 3DS 2018 games, they were still using a round sound canvas AC88, and we will see later it's going to be quite important for me. So here it is. So the risk, in turn, you risk data loss, of course, if you don't take care of your archiving, and at some point someone comes to see you and say, hey, let's remaster this game, do you still have your files? Well, no, you are going to lose a lot of time searching for them. Maybe you cannot reopen them. Maybe your plugins doesn't work anymore. Maybe you don't have the certificate for some of your sound bank. I know somebody that had this problem recently. And for example, I put unwanted changes in sound and interactivity, but I was thinking about some games that I don't know if some of you have already worked on a port from the PS3 to the PS4. Well, sound. I know some people that have lost more than 1 month of development just to fix something very stupid. And the second problem, the second risk is what I call misconception, meaning that there are fans, there are a lot of people that love video game music, and they want to know how it was made, so they are going to make their own little investigation, and they are going to bear some conclusions that are completely false, and that's where I come with my examples. So my first example is a good one. Do you know Golden Sun? It's an old Game Boy Advance game. It came out in 2001, and the music is made by Motoi Sakuraba. It's very, very good when we see the Game Boy Advance device. And a fan called Cortergeist decided to make his own remastered fan-made edition, because when a few years back, when you came online and searched for the game music, as there wasn't any official soundtrack, well, the only things you found about the game online was some game rips made with a jack directly into the Game Boy Advance, so it has a lot of noise. It was terrible. So he decided to take all the files directly from the game and try to put them into some kind of device and try to make it work. It was supposed to be very simple. But a few things to know. The first one is that the game runs on SAPI sound engine. It's a terrible sound engine, and we will see why a little later. The second thing important is that the composer used samples and instruments that came from the Roland SC88. So there was already this one. And in the game, the instrument, well, the music was using MIDI plus instrument data, everything put together, and bam, it's okay. So it's supposed to be simple. You just have to take the MIDI, to take the instrument, to assign the good instrument to the good MIDI, and here we go. But there was two instruments that had some problems because it was the flutes and the synthesizer. They have velocity-based modulation, so it's not supposed to be a big deal, except that the SAPI sound engine cannot handle those kind of modulation. So Cortogeist find himself with some MIDI that didn't have instruments. They had no instrument data, so it was missing something. He guessed that they were written in runtime. To compensate for the absence of instrument data, they had to find another way around to implement the instrument as Sakuraba wanted it. So he recreated everything from scratch in a DAW. And here it can seem quite simple because we know it comes from the SC88, so why not take the SC88 and just take the sound? Well, a Game Boy Advance cartridge is 8 to 16 megabytes, so you cannot just take the AC instrument and put them in their original state. You have to make a massive compression. So to give you an example, so here is an original fan-made a bad version of the music. And here is a second remastered version. So he did quite a good job, but if someone else tried actually to recreate the sound of Golden Sun using the original device. And here we have two visions of the archive. We have his vision. He wants to recreate not the SC88 sound, but the Game Boy Advance sound. So that's why he took so much time to recreate everything into a DAW, and it was pretty complicated. So this is a good example of a fan-made game, of fan-made research, etc. But we have to know that it's the fact that it's in runtime, etc. It's not 100% sure because we don't know how the Game Boy Advance works. It's very mysterious. And the second example is very recent. It's still a work in project. Do you all know Conker's Bad Fur Day and the Rare Studio? Okay. Maybe you know that it was the first game on the N64 using MP3 compression. Because the game came out in 2001. MP3 came out around 1995. But it wasn't popular until the end of the 1990s. So the first Rare game to use this format is Conker's Bad Fur Day, even if they gave the decompression code to Perfect Dark Team, so they could implement dialogues into their games. So it's very important. It's the first MP3 on N64. We wanted with a friend to learn more about it and how it was implemented in the game because it's pretty impressive. and I searched on tech forums, etc., and I found something very strange about some extracted files. There was these people saying, okay, I extracted all the files from the cartridge, directly from the cartridge, but I have something very peculiar, meaning that it's all good, the MP3 is okay, but Conker's voice is like sped up and pitched. So why is there a character's voice that is sped up? It's very strange. And other people responded, well, it must be because there hasn't much space on the N64. So as it was 64 megabytes, and they had to implement music, graphics, etc. It was a headache, really. Maybe they choose to make smaller files while accelerating them, and then in the process, the files were decompressed and slowed. So it took less place, and here we go. But have you ever heard of a game using this kind of... yeah, really?
It's a really good old technique.
Okay, because...
Players like us.
Yeah. Okay.
Pretty common.
Because here is the thing. We were ready to get up on our horse and to yell, oh, it's awesome, Conker's Bad Fur, they have a very fun thing. But just to check, I sent a message to Robin Vinland, the composer for the game. He also told me some interesting things about how the music was in the game. The first one is that the cutscenes mixed MP3 vocals with MIDI plus RDPCM instrumental sound. So we have multiple formats running in the same time. Okay, but during gameplay, all the eventual vocals are in RDPCM because there was not enough processing to handle the MP3 decompression and the gameplay at the same time. It was not possible. And most importantly, Mike Currington wrote TSP code that gave the ability to play 32 MIDI channels in synchronization. And for me, it's very important because when you look at old composers' interviews from the N64, most of the time they are amazed because they have 16 channels. And here we have 32, so it's pretty impressive. But there is a reason why it wasn't just possible. Actually, the voice that are sped up and the voice that are at a normal speed, they are all in the same file. So it looks like it was actually a decoding problem or an extraction problem. We don't know if it was, if it's because it's an old MP3 and something have changed and our computers cannot read it anymore. But here is some example. This is the MP3 version.
Am I interrupting something here? What?
That you get an outfit. It's cool. It hurts.
Deal.
So, okay, we have something that is pretty wrong here. The funniest thing is I tried to put it in wave format and it doesn't sound the same. Here is my wave.
What?
That you get an outfit. It's cool. It hurts.
Deal.
So it's probably only a format problem or an extraction problem, but we almost made it historical. And that's the real risk that it is that we are going to talk nonsense about your work. And now I propose that you take my place.
Yeah. I started my little company in 2000. We didn't start by specializing in video game music. It just came naturally because I'm such a video game music nut and technology, and I don't know. I just love old consoles and figuring out how they work. And yeah, so that's it. A bit more about me. I've been making commercial VST plugins and hosts. You might have heard of Bidule. Anyone here? It's a modular host that some people use. It shows its age, but it's still useful. And I'm not here to make a commercial rant for my company. It's really on the personal side. 15 years of console and sound chip research, so from like Ataris, Famicoms, Commodore 64, and recently I've been really interested in the 16-bit era, so we've just released a Mega Drive or Genesis synthesizer, and we're doing a Super Nintendo now. So that's the end of the company thing. I'm part-time MAME contributor. Everybody knows MAME here. That's the thing that's exciting, is that there are many, we all know like the Segas and the Nintendos, but there's many obscure consoles that just appeared on the market and disappeared right away. And those are the sort of stuff that interests me, because like, how's their graphics different, and how's their sound, and how does it compare with things that happen at the same time? So I've done some work in MAME to contribute to these very obscure things that no one has heard of. Both writing the C++ driver code and run dumps and the audio emulation side, but it's really part-time. I'm working really full-time in my company. And recently I started doing semi-serious YouTube videos about my research and also hacks that I make with, it's really a mix and match of like vintage synthesizers, consoles, MIDI, and research mix and match. I try to make videos that haven't been made before, and I make them like once every 6 months. I made one recently on how to spot fake or recycled Yamaha chips if you want, because there's a huge aftermarket right now of people wanting to make MIDI synthesizers based off the Genesis sound chips and various other things. And most of these guys buy stuff on eBay and they don't know what they're getting. And what they don't know is the chips have actually been recycled in very crude manner in China, being sanded and painted over and sold as new on eBay. And so you don't know like if they're going to fail in 5 months or not. You have no guarantee, and basically you're getting screwed. All sorts of stuff. So this is for the presentation. Back to our topic of things and which, say you take one game, like what are you gonna, what do people think when they hear a particular soundtrack? Right now it's pretty much, well, there are regional differences now, but at the time there were pretty worse case of regional differences. So what do you keep? Because I'm gonna show you an example of early Castlevania game. Everyone knows Castlevania. No, I guess it's fine. I'm just going to do the remixing after. I'm going to play example from the Japanese version that came before, and the CC 1989, and then 90 Dracula's Curse in the US. The level is going to be a bit weird. Just going to start slow. Interesting, you should count the number of voices that you heard. I don't have the, I didn't bring a Nintendo, but I do have the real cartridge here for this presentation. I'm just going to put that on the flash card. So now I'm going to play the North American version, or the world version actually. Let's press SD card noise. Anybody knows what that happened between these two versions? So basically what happened is that the original Japanese Famicom was designed before the North American one, and the big difference, well, they're essentially the same. They have the same address space, same CPU, same PPU, so graphics are the same. The internal audio is the same. The difference is the cartridge actually passes through the audio. So there's actually, most of the earlier games just had a jumper between two of the cartridge pins, and the audio just went from the cartridge, from the console into the cartridge and back to the output. Except at one point, designers figured out that, hey, we could add more voices and create more advanced soundtracks. So what you're hearing now, the first one was the Konami VRC6 mapper that's inside this cartridge. That chip could also make, well, the Japanese designed a bunch of audio chips that actually add different stuff. And this VRC6 is only used in 3 games in Japan, so it makes it quite cool and rare. And of course, when they ported that over, actually when they ported the Nintendo over, you see the date. I mean, everybody know that the Nintendo was already existing in North America in '89, but this audio pass-through thing didn't make the North American version, so they couldn't use this extra channel even though they could. It wouldn't be fed back to the console. So that's why they had to completely rearrange the soundtrack. And I mean, if you only know the North American one, I mean, that's fine, but if you listen to the other one and compare, that's what you get a big shock. Also, well, everybody knows PAL, especially previously, there was a huge change in pitch and 60 hertz to 50 hertz. And since the consoles were quite simple and that there's a master clock and it was divided to generate the audio, typically the audio is not at the same pitch and not at the same speed, so the BPM is not the same. So which one do you keep? Originally, there's less original games. There were French made originally, but there's STX and Smurf and all sort of stuff that are native to France and didn't make it here. And so you'd keep the PAL version there and keep the NTSC versions for the rest. But again, Japan and North America are both NTSC, but we know that they can sound much different. There's 3 extra voices in the VRC6, so a big fat saw bass that you heard, and 2 extra pulse wave that have 8 different pulse widths. The other thing that's interesting, so you'd think what a waste to use like just 3 games, but this one has an FM chip, official Yamaha FM chip in that one. So it wasn't actually hi-fi, this thing. Typical FM, but only 2 operators, so that's not as impressive as a Genesis, but still, that comes from a Nintendo, so that's not the type of stuff that you hear normally. So this chip is rather unique, so if you're going to emulate like all the Nintendo stuff, then you need to emulate perfectly a special chip that was used for 1 game only. So that's kind of cool for me, anyway. Cartridges, I was talking a bit about obscure cartridges. Anybody heard about the Casio PV1000? It's a very obscure console that came out in Japan right around when the Famicom was launched, and Famicom just killed everything. The Casio PV1000, not the only one. There's like 5 or 6 consoles that appear in Japan. And when I bought this, like the game wasn't dumped, or I mean, the Japanese kept it from themselves because the Japanese don't distribute ROMs over the internet. So if you want the whole world to have them, normally you need to do it. So I need to buy that on Yahoo Auction Japan for an enormous amount of money.
I spoke earlier about 2 different versions of archiving, private and company, and historical and public, but in Japan it's only private. Archives are not made for everyone to see, in opposition to us where we want everyone to know everything. They're very restrictive about who can see a specific archive, yeah. So it's a good job.
So basically, if you want to create, if you want to preserve these things, this is a very ugly rig. But typically, this is a Unisonic Champion cartridge. That's even rarer. There's probably 500 of them made. It's the ancestor to the Intellivision. I won't go into the details, but the General Instrument created a chipset that they tried to sell to many OEMs, and Mattel bought the high-end one to make the Intellivision, but the mid-range chipset was used only for this thing, and it only has like 5 or 6 crappy card games. But for me, as an archivist, I really wanted to have them. And one guy in Montreal, North Shore, had all the cartridges, so I designed a little thing based on a FTDI serial to parallel converter USB, a little crappy rig there, and I created my own code to dump this thing. and I also made the main driver for it and the sound emulation. But it was very crude, but it was fun. So if you want to say, but let's forget about very rare stuff. Say I've got, I don't know, for some reason, a unique version of Super Mario Bros. 3, then you still need to find a ways to dump this. It's kind of easy because, I mean, this is known, but you still need to find, if we're interested in sound, then from all the data, you need to disassemble the 6502 code, figure out what's data, what's music, and there are people that spend lots of time like figuring out in the code that's there, like what's what. So I use IDA a lot. You've probably heard of IDA, interactive disassembler. Anyway, and you rip it. Problem. There's currently 164 different sound formats, more or less. So that's what this site logs about different uncompressed, compressed, mod-like, MIDI-like, just logging. So the difference between logging is that logging is just raw data that's just think of a text file saying at this moment in time, like I don't know, time 25, this chip has been written register like 15 to FF or something, you know. And this is very crude, takes a lot of space, but sometimes it's very convenient way. So if you get VGM files out there, that's what it is. It's just logged. There's no code in there. There's no structure in there. It's really just the raw data that's been sent initially to a sound chip. The RIP formats, people have heard of the NSF format, the SID format, or the SPC format. These are more interesting, and the GBS format. These are actually parts of the ROM code inside there, but only the routines that were generating sounds. So this is much more interesting in terms of preservation because you can see the sort of routines that the programmers use. You can make differences between sound engines because sound engines have, I don't know, magic bytes here and there. Okay, so that's this version of that engine, so you know. And of course, you can figure out then lots of stuff. Yeah, the sequence format, if it's mod, it contains like the equivalent of MIDI per Pluchabun's sample. Or, I mean, if you're talking like some PS1 or PS2 games, then you can extract the full soundtracks if they're full soundtracks. But that's falling into the land that I find less interesting because I like to figure out weird formats and recreate them. Then there's nearly as many different sound chips in existence. We all know like the chip in the Super Nintendo, the Commodore 64 SID, but then you fall into the Yamaha chips. There's a whole bunch of YM somethings, and some are parents. There's like a big tree of like this came before and that has 3 FM voices of 4 operator. This has 6. This has 4, but not the same ones. This has 80 PCM that's different. And so basically, if you're doing a big emulator like MAME, you need to emulate all of these things. And MAME does a very good job. It's a big all-arounder, but of course, not everything is going to be emulated to the same level. And some of it is BSD license, some of it is GPL. Some authors just left. The code is done by different people, so there's stuff is better commented or less commented. Some also provided the code with actual research behind it, like this is the proof that I actually tested on hardware and these are the tests that I made. But sometimes it's just, this is the chip, and if nobody knows any better, then they're going to take that for granted, even though it might be completely out of whack. But many of the stuff in MAME and in emulators is being cross-checked by everyone with YouTube rips of actual hardware. So that's difficult because if you go on YouTube and you type, and this is one thing that she discussed a bit, if you type, I want a soundtrack of something, what do you get? Yeah, I briefly discussed emulation accuracy of sound, of audio. The biggest mistake that newbie emulation creators create is assuming that simple waveforms are easy to synthesize, and it's not true, especially for square waves, which can alias quite bad and quite easily. And the big question is, how do you know what is good or bad if you only listen to emulators all your life? And that parallels with whatever you can find on YouTube, which is usually either bad emulation rips or emulation rips with added reverb or panning, which is like, you might like it, you might not like it. You might
That's not what
find
sounds-
it's interesting to add reverb and panning because it sounds better now, but that doesn't represent what it is, what it should be, and what it was originally and how it sounded. Who's worked in DSP? Who knows DSP here? Yeah. So you know about aliasing, you know about waveform generation and band limiting and all of that. That's the big issue with square waves is that if you take something very old, digital, an electronic device that's driven by a master clock, and you divide some like 1.79 megahertz into you count for a certain amount, that creates your pitch. But the transitions from low to high is very precise based on a clock. And so in fact, a real Nintendo, its sample rate is 1.789 megahertz. So if you want to represent all these different frequencies at 44 kilohertz or 48, then if you just go around and say where my transition from low to high should appear like somewhere around here, that's what creates aliasing. You need to be very sure that your transitions are like oversampled or band limited. And that costs a lot of CPU time. So if you look at, so that's the 3DS Virtual Console, Wii U Virtual Console, a bit better, and the worst emulator I've seen. What's that? It's a bit aliasy on a real one. Say no alias. There's all the frequency content makes sense and the harmonics made sense. There's no like this harsh digital noise. There's going to be noise in a real console. You're going to hear low buzz. It's going to be filtered normally, and you might have like background noise of something. But the very bright waveforms should be pure. So that's the thing here. If you want to emulate, especially like the not the logged format, but the ripped format, you need to emulate the CPU cores correctly. The synthesis, all the envelopes, like especially in FM synthesis, they're really important. The interpolation of the waveforms, if they're there or not. All the edge cases of like what happens if I shove like FFFFFF in the pitch register or 0 in the pitch register. What happens? Sometimes there's doubling, sometimes there's mirroring, sometimes there's like all sorts of fallbacks. And that's the case in point is that if you take some emulators, Nintendo emulators, and some, I think, Mega Man games used to shut down. There's one voice that you can't really shut down fast and easily. So the trick would be to set it to a frequency that's like ultrasonic, so like, I don't know, 80 kilohertz or something like that. So typically you won't hear it. If it's naturally synthesized and filtered, you won't hear it. But if it's generated by emulator, a bad emulator, like the aliasing fallback will be all around the place. So you hear a big buzz that's atonal with the rest of the stuff. So that's just an example of like the typical, that's my Visual C++ regression test for all the weird opcodes of the 6502 and blah, blah, blah. So that's, someone makes this thing seriously should really think about this. A new thing arrived in the scene. Anybody knows about Artemio Urbinas in the emulation scene? He's been doing a thing called the 250p emulation suite. It's basically a ROM that you can use on all the homebrew ROM that you can use on all these vintage consoles to try to see and to calibrate your vintage CRT and RGB monitors depending on which console you have. But recently he's created something very, very simple that, I mean, you just had to have the idea. It's basically FFT, plotted FFT graph to compare the digital signature of consoles. So between like just the Sega Genesis, there's like 6 or 7 models, and they all have their different filtering. So low pass at a certain point and high pass at a certain point. And the balance between channels could vary because there's actually 2 sound chips in the Sega Genesis. This is a very, very crappy Famiclone device. And this is actually, I'm going to play, if I have time. That's the sort of stuff that this test runs. So basically it's just sweeps on all the different waveforms, trying to find some edge cases. Now I'm just going to go back to MDF. And so that's one thing. That's the run. So this is how this thing generates audio and how it filters it. So the DPCM pitch that this console generates is like minus 18 dBs off in that range of the spectrum. So this sort of tool is very important for anyone in the community, because right now there's very cool FPGA-based systems like the analog stuff that Keftres has done, which is amazing. And so basically everyone either creates emulations, software emulations, or FPGA emulations can have one thing to agree on to compare like the spectral signature. So this not only allows you to, at the end of the chain, to make sure that you got the filtering right, but also the relative volumes of all the different waveforms that you can generate. Basically, like the other challenge, whether or not you're a musicologist, is to get access to these things. Of course, different emulators and different quality emulators are not always available on all platforms. The web stuff, I mean, right now, you heard about this, that MAME runs in JavaScript. It's been converted by an NScriptM into JavaScript, and it runs in a browser, much slower than of course, if it's like natively compiled, but it's still very interesting that you can play the Atari, I think that's 7800 version of Asteroid in a browser, and I mean, it's a quick way to get it. And the Internet Archive has this umbrella of good faith and goodwill, so it's not getting cease and desisted like some other commercial sites get. I didn't really make that slide much, and it's not meant as a publicity, but it's hard for musicologists to take these formats that I talked about before and just extract partitions, because how do you interpret, like what's a voice, especially in the days when the original Nintendo has 5 voices and only like 3 of them are musically useful for pitches. And they can be reused, like if you have a pseudo orchestra of like 8 or 16 parts and you're limited to a limited amount of voices, then you're going to recycle and reuse stuff. So analyzing this data and figuring out, well, is it playing that part or that part, and how do we convert that to either a MIDI file? It's really a challenge. And yeah, there are more and more, sadly, I discussed this previously, when I started, there weren't that much good tools to do that in a DAW, but right now there's plenty, so we're doing like massive amount of work to make it even better and even closer to hardware. So this is our Sega Genesis VST that we just released a few months ago. That's really it for the main presentation.
Okay.